June 1940. The map of Europe in the war rooms looked like a wound that wouldn't stop spreading. Red pins marking British positions had been yanked out of France and shoved back across the Channel. German flags, small and precise, crawled over Belgium, Holland, and now most of France. Fresh holes in the cork still showed where someone had torn French tricolors off the board. In the underground cabinet room in London, Winston Churchill sat at the head of the long table and stared at a different sheet of paper that felt, in its own way, just as dangerous as that map. It wasn't a battle report. It was a list of ships. Dunkirk, Strasbourg, Provence, Bretagne, heavy cruisers, destroyers, submarines, the French fleet, the second largest in Europe, the only thing on this side of the continent big enough, if turned the wrong way, to make even the Royal Navy flinch. Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, First Sea Lord, sat to Churchill's right, shoulders hunched, eyes red-rimmed from too many nights, with no real sleep. He tapped the list with a blunt finger. "Prime Minister," he said, voice hoarse, "if the Germans get their hands on these ships, the balance at sea changes overnight. Our margin is not what it once was. We're stretched as it is. With those hulls under German control, the Royal Navy may not be able to protect the convoys." He paused. "And if we lose the convoys, sir, we lose the island." Churchill didn't answer immediately. He heard other sounds instead. The hammering of German guns at Dunkirk, the chaos on the beaches, the reports of French rear guards being overrun, while British destroyers crammed their decks with exhausted men and turned for home. He heard the metallic, bitter calm of Marshal Pétain's radio broadcast, announcing that France was asking for an armistice. He had known Pétain as the Lion of Verdun, a man who had once made Germans bleed dry in trenches. Now that same man's voice had trembled as he told France to lay down its arms. Honor, Pétain had said, demanded it. Churchill had almost thrown the wireless set at the wall. Now he sat in the stale air of the war rooms and tried to calculate what another man's honor was worth when German tanks were parked on his lawn. He picked up the list of ships. The names blurred for a moment. "What do the armistice terms say about the fleet?" he asked quietly. Pound shifted in his chair. "On paper, sir, the French fleet is to be disarmed under German or Italian control," he said. "The French assure us they will never allow their ships to pass to Germany. They promise they will scuttle them first, if necessary." He hesitated before the next words. "But, Prime Minister, once they are in French and North African ports, disarmed under German supervision, we have no guarantees, only promises." The word dropped into the center of the room. Promises. Churchill had watched Hitler tear up treaties like scrap paper. He had read the Munich Agreement and then watched Czechoslovakia vanish anyway. He had listened to men in this very building defend those guarantees not so long ago. Now they were gone. He leaned back, chair creaking, cigar unlit in his hand. "Let us be precise," he said, his voice steady. "If Hitler acquires the French fleet intact, he could combine it with his own surface forces and U-boats and attempt to sever our Atlantic lifeline. If he succeeds, we are starved out or forced to terms. If that happens, this island falls. And with it," he jerked his chin at the bleeding map, "everything." The ministers around the table shifted. Anthony Eden, Clement Attlee. Old political enemies who now, under the weight of a common catastrophe, sat side by side. They had watched France, the great ally from the last war, crumple in 6 weeks. Their nerves were raw. The idea that the next enemy on the list might be wearing a French uniform made something in them recoil. Churchill looked at Pound over the rims of his glasses. "What options do we have?" he asked. Pound removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly, buying a few seconds that felt like more than habit. "We can accept Vichy's assurances," he said. "We can take Pétain at his word that the fleet will never be handed over. We can trust their honor." He looked up, and for a moment the mask of the professional sailor slipped. "Or," he said, "we can make it impossible for those ships to ever serve Germany, whatever Vichy intends." "How?" someone asked from down the table, though the cold in Pound's eyes already gave the answer away. "Force," he said simply. The file name they wrote on the order was neat and bloodless. Operation Catapult. It sounded like something you'd do to a stone, not to allies. The plan on paper was simple. In one coordinated move, the Royal Navy would neutralize every French warship it could reach. In British ports, French crews would be seized at gunpoint and their ships taken over or immobilized. In Alexandria, a British admiral would negotiate with the French squadron there, guns loaded under the table. And off the coast of French North Africa, Force H, a powerful Royal Navy task force, would sail to a dusty, little-known harbor called Mers-el-Kébir, near Oran. There, inside a narrow, stone-walled anchorage, lay a French squadron strong enough to alter the war at sea. The fast battle cruisers, Dunkirk and Strasbourg. The older battleships, Provence and Bretagne. Cruisers, destroyers. Enough steel and guns that, if ever pointed the wrong way, could rip convoys apart and make any attempted British resistance a suicide note. Churchill sent for Admiral James Somerville, newly appointed to command Force H. Somerville entered the war rooms with the understated stiffness of a man who had spent his life on decks that could kill you if you forgot what you were standing on. Churchill didn't bother with small talk. "Admiral," he said, "you know the situation in France." "Yes, Prime Minister." "You know the size of the French fleet and what would happen if Hitler got his hands on it." "Yes, sir." Churchill pushed the paper across. "We cannot and will not permit that," he said. "You are to sail to Mers-el-Kébir with Hood, Resolution, and supporting forces. You will present Admiral Gensol with a series of alternatives." He ticked them off with the cigar. "First, he can sail with you and continue the war at our side. Second, he can sail his ships under reduced crews to British ports for internment. His men may be repatriated in due course. Third, he can sail them to the United States or to some French territory beyond German influence, the West Indies, for example, to be disarmed there. And if he refuses all of these?" Somerville already knew the answer. He still asked, because asking put the weight where it belonged. "If he refuses," Churchill said, eyes now like stone, "you are to use such force as is necessary to prevent those ships being used against us." The words were quiet. They felt louder than any bomb. Somerville's jaw worked. "Prime Minister," he said slowly, "you are aware what you are asking the Navy to do? These men fought beside us at Narvik, at Dunkirk. Our captains know their captains. There are friendships, shared graves. We will be firing on our comrades of yesterday." "I am aware," Churchill said. For a heartbeat, the mask cracked. The bulldog face sagged. "This is against the grain," he admitted. "The most unnatural, painful of measures. But if we allow sentiment to cloud this, and 6 months hence those same ships appear under German control in the Channel or the Atlantic, the people of Britain will rightly ask us why we did not act when we could." He leaned forward, the cigar now a baton. "I would rather be cursed for what I did to save this island than mourn because I flinched." Somerville held his gaze. He saw Gallipoli in those eyes, the ghost of the last time Churchill had gambled with ships and men and paid for it with his career and their lives. "Very well, sir," Somerville said quietly. "I will carry out my orders." He turned to leave. "Admiral," Churchill said, Somerville stopped. "You are to exhaust every avenue before you fire," Churchill said, voice suddenly rough. "Every word of comradeship, every appeal to honor. But if they will not move, if they will not accept internment or sail away beyond Hitler's reach." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Somerville nodded once. "I understand, Prime Minister." Mers-el-Kébir, French Algeria. The harbor lay under a hard, white sun. The sea was a sheet of blue glass, broken only by the long, dark shapes of ships and the occasional white feather of a gull. On the foredeck of the battleship Britannia, a group of French sailors lounged shirtless, smoking and playing cards. The paint on the steel was fresh. The war hadn't had time to scar these hulls much yet. The men's faces, though, were already older than their years. They had heard about Paris, about German tanks in the Champs-Élysées, about the exodus of civilians clogging the roads, about a government split between men who wanted to sail the fleet to the colonies and keep fighting, and men who wanted to sign whatever paper the Germans pushed across the table and call it Saving France. One of the sailors flicked ash over the side. "Alors," he said, "we fight for nothing, eh? We sit here and polish the guns, while the Boches march under the Arc de Triomphe." His friend shrugged. "Better here than in a prison camp," he muttered. "At least we have the sea." In his cabin aboard the modern battlecruiser, Dunkerque, Admiral Marcel Gensoul read a cable from Vichy for the 10th time. "Do not allow ships to fall into foreign hands. Avoid conflict with British forces. Stop disarmament to be conducted under Axis. Supervision. Maintain honor of French Navy." So many orders. None of them covered what he could see now from his bridge. His flag captain burst in, face flushed. "Mon amiral, lookouts report heavy masts approaching from the west. At least one battlecruiser, several other large units. British silhouettes." Gensoul's heart gave a complicated lurch. "Les Anglais," he said softly. He walked out onto the bridge. He raised his binoculars. On the horizon, growing larger against the glittering sea, were gray hulls and tall tripod masts. One of them, long and lean with a distinctive profile, was unmistakable. HMS Hood. The last time he had seen that ship, she had been an ally. "What do they want?" his captain murmured. "To talk," Gensoul said, "or to watch, or to threaten. We shall see which." He did not add the quiet thought running under the words. Or all three. The British destroyer Foxhound nosed toward the harbor under a flag of truce. On her deck stood Captain Cedric Holland, an officer who spoke good French and had absolutely no desire to say the sentences he'd been ordered to deliver. He clutched a leather pouch under his arm as the ship slowed, a white flag snapping alongside the white ensign. On the breakwater, French officers watched through binoculars. "Un parlementaire anglais," one said. "They come like diplomats, with guns behind them." Gensoul received Holland in his cabin, treating him with formal courtesy that was almost an insult. The British officer saluted. "Mon amiral," he began in French. "I am Captain Holland of His Britannic Majesty's Navy, representing Admiral Somerville. I am instructed to deliver to you a communication of the highest importance." "An ultimatum?" Gensoul asked sharply, seizing on the word before it was spoken. Holland's jaw flexed. "A proposal, sir," he said. "Options, from the British government to the French Navy." He handed over the paper. Gensoul broke the seal and read, "Sail and continue the fight at our side. Sail to British ports and be interned. Sail to neutral or distant ports and disarm. Or remain and be destroyed." The muscles in his face tightened with each line. He looked up. "Face such force as is necessary," he quoted. "Your government has a polite way of saying, 'We will kill you.'" "Admiral," Holland said carefully, "London is convinced, Gensoul snapped. Convinced of what? That we, the Marine Nationale, will drop our ships into Hitler's lap like a mistress giving up her jewels? He slapped the paper with the back of his hand. We have given our word. Our government has given its word. Holland's eyes were steady, but there was strain in them. With respect, sir, Berlin and Vichy's words are not the same thing, he said. My government fears that, under pressure, your government may be forced. Your government abandoned ours at Dunkirk, Gensoul cut in, voice rising. You saved your own troops and left our divisions to be crushed. And now you come to lecture us about honor? There it was, the raw wound. It wasn't just about ships. It was about 2 weeks of chaos and smoke and retreat, about British vessels pulling away from French beaches loaded with Tommies, while French soldiers threw down their rifles or marched into captivity. Holland swallowed. He had been at Dunkirk. He had watched British destroyers take on more men than they were built for, watched some sink under bombs and shells, watched French troops cram aboard where they could, and others wave feebly as the last ships turned for home. We did what we could, he said quietly, and we mean to go on fighting. That is why we are here. If the Germans get your ships, they will use them against us, against you one day, when they no longer need you. We are trying to prevent that day. Gensoul's eyes glittered. At the price of our blood, he said. At the price of firing on the French flag, he straightened. You will convey my reply, he said, voice icy. The French Navy does not accept ultimatums. We will not set sail under British orders. We will not surrender our ships. And if you open fire on us, Captain, the shame will not be ours. Holland's face flushed. Admiral, he said, Somerville does not want to fire. None of us do. But his instructions are clear. Mine, too. For a moment, the British officer dropped the formal tone. You and I, sir, he said, wear the same salt on our boots. Our men have fought the same enemy. Please, don't make us enemies today. Gensoul's reply was very soft. It is not I who makes us enemies, he said. It is London. He saluted. The signal was unmistakable. The audience was over. Aboard HMS Hood, Admiral Somerville paced the flag bridge, hands clasped behind his back. Below, in the afternoon glare, the gray hulls of his task force cut the water in a neat, practiced line. Beyond the breakwater, inside the bottle-shaped harbor, he could see the faint outlines of French masts and funnels. His captains waited for Holland to return. What do you think, sir? One asked quietly. Will Gensoul see reason? Somerville's mouth twisted. He is a French admiral, whose government has just been humiliated, and whose country is occupied, he said. Reason is not the language in fashion this month. Holland climbed back aboard, face set. Somerville read the report without comment. Refusal of all options. Insistence on honor. Flat denial that the ships will ever be surrendered to Germany. Complete rejection of internment. Somerville walked to the chart table. Signal the Admiralty, he said, and the Prime Minister. The wireless set crackled. To Admiralty and Prime Minister. French Admiral Gensoul refuses all proposals, declares he will not surrender fleet, nor accept internment. Claims his honor is insulted. Awaiting further instructions. Somerville. The answer took long enough that the air itself seemed to tense. On the French ships, sailors watched British masts through binoculars and muttered, Regarde-moi ça. They sit out there with their guns pointed at us and speak of honor. They won't fire, another insisted, trying to convince himself. Not on us. We are allies. It's a bluff. On Hood, gun crews were ordered to stand by. Turrets trained slowly toward the harbor mouth, their long barrels like accusing fingers. On land, in a nearby cafe, Algerian dock workers and French civilians stepped outside to squint at the strange standoff. In London, the signal was brought down to the war rooms. Churchill read it standing up. For a second, the room seemed to shrink around the page. He had hoped, childishly, that this might be the rare wartime problem that solved itself. That Gensol would hose his boilers, weigh anchor, and sail into British arms, cursing Hitler as he came. Instead, pride had answered pride. Anthony Eden saw Churchill's hand tighten around the paper. "Winston," he began. Churchill cut him off. "If those ships slip from our grasp tonight to fall under Hitler's claw tomorrow, we shall be cursed as fools," he said. "If we act now, we shall be cursed as murderers. I prefer the latter to seeing this island grow quiet under a foreign jackboot." He picked up a pen. The words he wrote were the kind that never make it into stirring speeches. "To Admiral Somerville, you are to force compliance with our terms. If this cannot be achieved by negotiation, you must use such force as is necessary to prevent French ships falling into German hands. Churchill." He signed his name. For a moment, his imagination betrayed him. He saw, not ships on a map, but one French boy, some Breton kid in a striped undershirt, on a gun deck that suddenly turned into a furnace under British shells, thinking with his last breath, "Les Anglais. It's the English killing me." He crushed the image, like a man grinding out a match before it can burn his fingers. "Send it," he said. On Hood, when the reply came in, the signal officer's voice was very flat. "From Admiralty, sir. Use such force as is necessary. Signed, Churchill." Somerville took the flimsy. He read it twice. He could almost hear Churchill's voice behind the typed letters, the growl underneath. He folded the paper without ceremony. "Very well," he said. "We proceed." One of his captains couldn't stop himself. "Sir, with respect, we're going to be firing into a confined harbor at anchored ships," he said quietly. "They can't maneuver. Their decks will be full of men. It will be—" He didn't finish. Somerville did it for him. "A massacre," he said. "Yes, which is why we will give them one more chance." He turned to the signal officer. "Signal Admiral Gensol," he said, in the clearest possible language. The halyards ran as colored flags climbed Hood's mast. "To Admiral Gensol. I must again urge you to accept one of the proposals. I am acting under direct orders from my government to prevent your ships being used against us. I do not wish to open fire. If you do not comply, I shall be compelled to do so. Somerville." The message fluttered in the sun. On Dunkirk, a petty officer called out the signal. Gensol read it in silence. "I do not wish to open fire," he repeated, mouth twisting. How noble of him. His flag captain shifted uneasily. "Mon amiral, perhaps we could consider sailing to Martinique, or to the United States. It would preserve the fleet and avoid bloodshed. We would not be submitting to the British, merely relocating." Gensol's temper flashed. "And leave Vichy to explain why its proud Atlantic fleet ran to hide behind American skirts?" he snapped. "Offer our ships to the Anglo-Saxons the moment the Boches glare at us? Is that your idea of honor?" "Non, mon amiral. I only meant—" "I know what you meant," Gensol said. "You meant we should back down because the British show their teeth. I do not back down. Not today." He crumpled the British signal in his fist. "Send this," he said to his communications officer. "The French fleet will obey the orders of the French government. We will not be bullied by our former allies. We will not surrender our ships." Outside, French gun crews stood to stations now, shells hoisted, breaches open. Some cursed the British so loudly the words carried over the water. "Traître! They run from France, then come to sink our ships." Others were quieter, hands shaking as they checked elevation and bearing. Of all the enemies they'd imagined facing when they joined the Navy, gray British hulls had not been on the list. Late afternoon, the sun sagged toward the horizon, throwing long reflections across the water. On the open sea, Hood and the ships of Force H steadied on their firing positions. On their decks, gun crews had helmets on, ear protection ready, hands resting on breech levers. On the French side, turrets strained against the limits of their arcs, trying to bear on targets they could barely see beyond the harbor mouth. In homes and cafes around Mers-el-Kébir, people stood on balconies and roofs, looking out at the unnatural sight of two friendly flags facing each other, down with guns. On Hood's bridge, Somerville checked his watch. "Signal to all ships," he said. "If the French have not indicated acceptance of our terms by 1730, we will open fire." "Aye, aye, sir." The signal flashed. 1730 crept closer with the speed of a slow-motion car crash. In London, Churchill paced the war rooms, cigar clamped between his teeth, refusing to look at the clock on the wall. He had made a career out of promising his people blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He had not told them that sometimes he would be the one ordering the blood to be spilled, and that it would belong to men who only weeks earlier had been called our gallant French allies in his speeches. In Mers-el-Kébir, Admiral Gensoul stood alone by a porthole, watching the gray shapes of the British ships. Pride and rage twisted together in his chest. "If I yield now," he thought, "I betray France into British hands to save my own skin. If I don't, they will kill my men and call it strategy." He straightened his shoulders. Better to die betrayed than live as the man who surrendered the fleet. Out beyond the breakwater, the guns of the Royal Navy lay quiet for the moment, their steel mouths fixed on ships that still flew the same tricolor that had flown beside them at sea for 20 years. Between them, the sea waited. Calm, indifferent, perfectly ready to swallow the bodies of men who, up until that day, had never imagined they might die facing the wrong way. The guns did not start with a roar, they started with a clock. 1725, on the bridge of HMS Hood, Admiral Somerville stood with his watch in his hand, the second hand sweeping toward the moment he had spent all day trying to avoid. Behind him, turrets X and Y sat ready, each barrel loaded, each breech sealed. The men inside the steel towers could not see the French ships. They could only see range dials, bearing indicators, and the backs of the men in front of them. "Range," a gunnery officer called. 11,000 yards to the breakwater, sir. French ships beyond, in harbor." 17,000 yards might as well have been next door. They weren't shooting at dots on a horizon. They were shooting into a bottle. On the other side of that bottle, in Mers-el-Kébir harbor, French sailors hurried to stations as last orders rang out. "Close watertight doors! Stand by main armament! Man the hoses!" Admiral Gensoul stood on Dunkirk's bridge, jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. "Any new signal from the British?" his flag captain asked. "Nothing," Gensoul said. He did not add the thought that had been gnawing at him all afternoon. If they were bluffing, they would have blinked by now. On Britannia's decks, the card players from the afternoon now stood by shell hoists, faces slick with sweat. "Think they'll really do it?" one muttered. His friend didn't answer. He was listening to the silence. Silence between former allies, pointed at each other across water, was not a good sign. 17:29. Somerville lowered his watch. He had sent the last signal. He had waited for a reply that hadn't come. He knew that somewhere under London, in a room full of stale air and maps, Winston Churchill was waiting for a telephone to ring or not ring. He knew that within minutes, whatever he did, would either be called Britain's survival or Britain's shame by people who had never stood on a bridge with both choices in their hands. He gave the smallest of nods to the gunnery officer. "Open fire," he said. The words were soft, Their consequences were not. On Hood, the order ran down through voice pipes and telephones. Commence firing. Inside a turret, a petty officer's mouth went dry. Stand by, he barked. On the next roll. Fire! Hood's great gun spoke. A deep, hammering concussion rolled along her deck as orange flame burst from the muzzles, kicking back a cloud of cordite smoke. The ship shuddered as recoil slammed into her bones. Farther out, the battleship Resolution joined in, then the cruisers. A British broadside tore across the water toward the trapped French ships. In the harbor, the first incoming shells arrived with almost no warning. One French lookout opened his mouth to shout and was cut off as a column of water taller than the mast exploded next to the breakwater, drenching the gun crew. The next shells weren't short. They hit. On Bretagne, the men at the forward turret heard a sound, like God slamming a door through steel. A 15-inch shell punched through her side near a magazine and detonated inside the ship. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the magazines went up. From Hood's bridge, officers watched in stunned horror as Bretagne turned into a volcano. A blinding yellow-white flash erupted amidships, followed by a billowing tower of smoke and debris. Her hull seemed to bulge, then rip apart. A shockwave tore across the harbor. One of Hood's signalmen flinched. "Dear God," someone whispered, "that's Bretagne." Where there had been a battleship a heartbeat before, there was now a broken, burning carcass, listing violently, flames licking from every opening. Men on her deck simply vanished. Others were hurled into the air like rag dolls, silhouettes briefly visible in the fireball before they disappeared into smoke and falling steel. In the water, sailors were thrown overboard, some already limp, some screaming. On Dunkirk and Strasbourg, the shock of the explosion shuddered through steel and bone. Gensoul grabbed a rail as the blast hit. "They've hit Bretagne's magazines," someone cried. She's gone, mon amiral!" He shoved the horror down. "Return fire," he snapped. "All batteries!" French guns spoke back, belated and blind. The geometry of the harbor worked against them. The ship sat moored along the breakwater, bows and sterns boxed in, their arcs of fire limited. Their shells roared out anyway, angry, defiant, punching fountains of water up around the British line. On Hood, the French return fire landed close enough to make men duck. "They're shooting back, sir." "Let them," the gunnery officer said through clenched teeth. "We have the range." He kept giving corrections, eyes never leaving his instruments. Inside his chest, something ached every time he saw a shell land among the French hulls. He did his job anyway. For the French sailors, the harbor turned into a furnace. A shell crashed into Provence, starting fires that raced along paint and oil. Another round smashed into Dunkerque's bow, tearing open plating, sending shockwaves through compartments. On Bretagne, everything was screaming metal, fire, and steam. The ship rolled, already dying. A sailor who had been shuffling cards an hour before now found himself clawing for a ladder that was suddenly a wall. "Vite! Vite!" someone shouted over the roar. "To the water! Saute! Jump!" Men leaped into the harbor, uniforms instantly dragging them down. Some resurfaced, thrashing. Others didn't. From shore, onlookers saw her capsize, belching smoke. There was no time to process the horror. Dunkerque's crew fought to keep their ship in the fight. "Hit aft!" a voice screamed into the speaking tube. "We have flooding! Fire in the engine room!" Gensoul gripped the chart table. He had wanted to prove that he would not be bullied. Now his men were paying the price for that proof, burned alive under the tricolor. On Hood's upper deck, a junior rating watched the French harbor burn through a slit in the shielding. He'd grown up on stories of Jutland, of British and German ships hammering each other on the open sea. This wasn't like that. "They're tied up, sir," he muttered to the petty officer beside him, voice raw. It's like shooting at a man in his bed. "Shut it," the petty officer said automatically. But he didn't say it very hard. He was thinking the same thing. In a turret, a loader's hand shook as he rammed another massive shell home. "Target?" he asked, out of habit more than need. "Dunkerque," came the answer. "That's a French name," he whispered under his breath, as if the word itself stung. The breech slammed shut. "Ready. Fire." The gun spoke again. Not all the French ships died where they lay. The battlecruiser Strasbourg, moored further inside, managed to raise enough steam to move. Her captain, seeing Bretagne explode and Dunkirk stagger under hits, made a choice. "Cut the moorings," he roared. "Full ahead! We're getting out!" Axes flashed as crews hacked at lines. Tugs tried to push. Engines screamed. French shells spat defiance at the British line as Strasbourg surged forward, smoke pouring from her funnels. On Hood, lookouts shouted, "Strasbourg underway, sir! Heading for the harbor entrance!" British gunners tried to adjust fire, but in the chaos, their shells landed just behind, just ahead, throwing up walls of water that couldn't quite box her in. Strasbourg burst through the harbor mouth, running a gauntlet of shell splashes, and bolted for the open sea, trailing wounded destroyers. On Hood's bridge, someone swore. "She's getting away." Somerville watched her go, a French battlecruiser fleeing British guns, smoke scars on her paint. Part of him was relieved. Part of him felt the cold hand of the Admiralty on his shoulder, already asking why he had not finished the job. "Continue to engage remaining targets," he said, voice flat. Within 15 minutes, the main slaughter was over. It felt longer. The harbor was a chaos of flame and smoke and twisted metal. Bretagne lay on her side, a blackened mass, oil fires burning around her hull. Provence was aground, listing, burning. Dunkerque was badly hit, settling in the shallow water, her bow down, superstructure scorched. The air stank of cordite, burning fuel, and something sweeter and uglier, burning flesh. In the water, hundreds of French sailors struggled among patches of flaming oil. Some swam toward shore, some swam toward anything that floated. Planks, life rings, bits of wreckage. Some didn't move at all. On shore, civilians and off-duty sailors threw life belts, ropes, anything they could. A French petty officer, chest deep in water, shoved a lifebuoy under another man's arms. "Tiens! Tiens, mon vieux!" A wave pushed them apart. From Hood, some British sailors watched through binoculars, wordless. One of them made as if to look away. "Keep your eyes open," his chief said harshly. "You helped do that. You don't get to blink now." It wasn't cruelty. It was a kind of penance. When Somerville finally gave the order to cease fire, the guns fell silent almost reluctantly. Hood's last shells landed among the smoke. The echoes rolled away. In their place came other sounds, distant explosions as secondary fires reached magazines, the crackle of burning paint, the faint cries of men in the water. Aboard the British ships, officers began taking stock. "Damage? Minor splintering, sir. Near misses from French return fire. No major hits. Casualties? Light. A few wounded." It was an asymmetric ledger. On the French side, the numbers were staggering. They would not know them exactly for days, but even in the first hours it was clear. Hundreds dead, more than 1,000 casualties. On Bretagne alone, entire gun crews had been erased in the initial blast. One French survivor, wrapped in a blanket on the dock, stared at the burning wreck and muttered the same word over and over. "Anglais. Anglais." As if he still couldn't believe who had been shooting at him. Far away, in London, the telephone finally rang in the war rooms. Churchill took the receiver himself. Somerville's voice came through with the clipped restraint of a man holding everything in. "Prime Minister, Engagement complete. Bretagne destroyed. Other units heavily damaged. Strasbourg and some destroyers have escaped. Our own casualties light. Churchill closed his eyes. How many French casualties? He asked. There was a pause. Initial reports say somewhere around 800, possibly more, sir, Somerville said. Likely over 1,000, when all are accounted for. 1,000. In his mind's eye, Churchill saw rows of white crosses from the last war, then superimposed fresh graves on top. Allied graves. He thanked Somerville, told him he had carried out his duty with courage, and hung up. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he spoke, more to himself than to anyone in the room. This is the most hateful decision and the most odious deed that I have ever had to take, he said. No one contradicted him. They all knew why he had done it. They also knew that knowledge did nothing to clean the blood off the ledger. In France, the news hit like a fist. Vichy radio denounced the attack as a cowardly act of aggression by perfidious Albion. The word Mers-el-Kébir became, overnight, a bitter curse in French mouths. Families who had sons on those ships listened to casualty lists with hands over their mouths. Some cried for vengeance against the Germans. Others cried for vengeance against the English. In one afternoon, a French officer would say later, Hitler could not have done more to separate us than the British did with those shells. In ports and cafes, men who had fought beside British soldiers in 1914-18 tore down pictures of British ships, spat on old toasts, and swore they would never forgive. The psychological victory, in that sense, was Hitler's. He watched his enemies tear each other apart without firing a shot. Among British sailors and officers, the mood was more complicated. On paper, it was a success. Enemy capital ships neutralized without serious British loss. In hearts and mess decks, it felt like something else. A petty officer on Hood, writing a letter he could never quite finish, put it simply. We did our duty, he wrote, ink blotting where his hand shook. But it did not feel like a victory. It felt like murder that someone told us was necessary. Somerville himself returned to Gibraltar with the taste of ash in his mouth. He had carried out his orders. He had also seen something his superiors would never fully see. The faces of men in the water, the French flag slumping on burning mastheads. Churchill, for his part, did something his critics rarely imagined. He went home that night and cried, not for long, not theatrically. He wept for the French sailors, for the British sailors who had fired, and for the rotten shape of a war in which the only way to prevent one disaster was to commit another. Then he dried his face, lit another cigar, and prepared to tell Parliament and the British people what had been done in their name. When he stood in the House of Commons and described the attack, he did not hide it. He did not call it a glorious action. He called it what it was, harsh, painful, and, in his judgment, necessary. The reaction was not what he had feared. The benches, hearing that the French fleet would not be turned against them, erupted in cheers. They applauded so loudly that the stenographers had to pause. They were not cheering dead French sailors. They were cheering the feeling, for once, that something had been done to keep the island alive. But underneath the applause, a quieter, colder question remained. At what cost to the soul? In the years that followed, the story of Mers-el-Kébir calcified into different myths. To some British admirals and politicians, it became proof of Churchill's iron will. The day he showed Hitler that Britain would stop at nothing, not even shooting at its friends, to deny him a weapon. To some French veterans, it remained a scar, a word spoken with clenched teeth. They remembered comrades burned alive at their posts, drowning in harbor water turned black with oil and blood. They remembered that the shells that killed them were stamped with British markings. They remembered that the admiral who ordered those shells fired believed he was protecting them, in the long run, from something worse. The men on both sides who had actually been there were left with a more complicated memory. They remembered the moment when enemy and ally stopped being clear labels on a map and turned into something messier. Men in one uniform killing men in another, not because they hated them, but because the logic of survival had twisted them into that position. The real betrayal at Mers-el-Kébir was not simple. It wasn't just Britain betraying France, or France betraying Britain. It was war betraying both, forcing them into a choice where every road led through other people's graves. Churchill chose the road that, in his calculation, kept Britain alive. Gensoul chose the road that, in his, kept French honor intact. In the harbor at Mers-el-Kébir, under a bright North African sun, those two choices crossed. And for a few terrible minutes, yesterday's allies were each other's executioners. History likes heroes and villains. That day, it mostly got men with shaking hands, doing things they would never fully forgive themselves for, so that someone else, somewhere, might have the luxury of living long enough to judge them.